And then finally, my name is Emily Holland. I'm the editor for Poet Lore, which is America's oldest poetry magazine. Check out our website, which is in the chat. And we have our next issue coming out at the end of the month, our fall winter issue that features about 60 poets, almost 100 poems from them and translations. So it'll be an exciting issue to get your hands on. And then I'll introduce Lauren, who is a previous Poet Lore contributor, which is so exciting. We love to kind of bring our contributors onto the chats and kind of see how far their poetry has taken them. So Lauren, welcome to our Craft Happy Hour. If you would just give us a brief introduction about, who you are, a little bit about the book, and then if you wouldn't mind just reading a poem or two to get us started.
Sure, I'm delighted to be here, and I've been watching the chat and seeing people coming in from Alaska and Japan, and seeing familiar faces, family, friends, students, people I don't know, people I know only on Facebook. So I want to say hello to everybody. First of all, thank you to the Writers Center, to Zach and Emily for doing this, and Amy, who I'm sorry you're muted, but thank you. So I came to poetry, I think I'll probably talk about this as we're in our conversation, but I came to poetry through a sort of double career in visual art and in radio broadcasting. So music, combining DJing and fiber art, and so color and pattern and all of that. And those were my introduction to poetry, which I did very much intuitively without education in it, or like formal education in it, until somebody called me out and said, who wrote these poems? And I had to clarify that there were no poems, that I didn't know what I was doing. And then go and look into sort of understanding what makes a contemporary poem. Took House is my fifth book. It came out in August from Tupelo Press. It's my second book with Tupelo Press. They did a beautiful job on both. The cover, just a quick call out on the cover, it's by an Albuquerque artist, Suzanne Sparge, and it perfectly matches the poems. It's almost as though she made the cover, the painting or mixed media collage to go with the poems. What else should I tell you? I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I've been here for 26 years. I got here in the same way I do everything, which is sort of through a quick decision, an intuitive gut decision. And here I am, and I love it here. And I guess that's about enough.
That's great.
So I'll read you, I think I'll read you two poems from the book. The first one I'm going to read is called The Night Clouds Wrestled the Sky. At that moment, I was blind to the sorrow and stop that was coming. For that gentle hour, I settled into the only split in the road, where I still saw the purple reflection of day slipping from cedar and aspen. Air temperature as skin would shift to bare and brisk. But in the sky, unguarded orange shadows advanced, and clouds extended to unkempt corners, the desert's chambers of gray. Trees unfurled their fluted, five-petaled, veined fingers, precision worth noting. What else should we look at but fugitive color, the shape that's not empty? So little of what happens belongs to us. Only the frequent sense of being encircled. After light was stripped from the scarlet wall, a string of birds armed long branches, rhapsodizing. I had entered the chatter-curved worship of their bursting, the song grafted to the moon's musky discipline. Once their noise was placed, it remained in my mind for years. Not a coincidence that I heard and saw a final stray sweep of sun as pigment and chord, and would summon it again next time I was swallowed, beat down. That night the sky came up to my lips. It tasted of wind and gave me something to miss. And the second poem I want to read you is, there's a series of poems in the book that are based on raptors, on that predator-prey relationship. So I thought I'd read you one of these. The poem is called Swainson's Hawk. And I see some of you following along, so I'll tell you it's on page 26 to make it easy for you. Swainson's Hawk. White throat and pointed wings, a perch in Spanish bayonet, in shinnery oak, in pasture. Small eyes tucking in to prey. I always forget the haste of dismantling the torn off evidence. Leopard, lizard, whiptail, kestrel, shrike. While stars are raw, a raptor feathered to the toes will eat grasped rats in bowls, collect the flapping bats. Another bone, another funeral, the supply nearly endless. I'm arriving on time to a table. The mouth holds sorrows. Teeth cling to the soundless. The leaves and root, the sunset rushes by. Somewhere, a rabbit worn in the hawk's beak.
Thank you. Thank you for reading those poems. I'm always so struck by the sound play that just comes through when we're able to hear the poems out loud. And I think that those two poems really are engaging with this kind of textural fabric of the words themselves. And so thank you for reading those. Well, those have kind of given me a few ideas of where to start with the conversation. So I think in thinking about the first poem you read and some of your introductory information about coming to poetry through visual art, I wonder if we can kind of dive in on some of the way that you use other artworks in this book as sort of inspirations for the poems in the ekphrastic form. And now I'm thinking you probably approached this in a different way than some just strict poets would, because you have the art background. So I wonder if you could talk through about your approach to the ekphrastic form and the different pieces of art that you use for inspiration for some of these poems.
Sure, I'd be glad to. I think I probably do it differently than someone coming at it from a strict poetry perspective. I think in a way that ekphrastic poems about art and art processes for me are not about matching what's there. It's a different form of translation. It's a kind of translation or transformation, maybe, where I'm interested in sometimes in answering one of two or three different questions. Why am I drawn to this piece? Perhaps that's one. Why? What is the artist doing here for me? And the other, I think the third question is usually, why did the artist do this? Like, why this medium? Why this energy put here? I know what it's like to make art. I know the medium that I used to work in was so hard. It was physically draining, exhausting. So I had to be incredibly motivated, determined to work within it sometimes on certain pieces in order to create whatever it was I was making. And so I'm often thinking about that. Who is this person working in this medium or in this way? Why resin? Why aluminum? Why this big space? Why something open? Why something dense? Whatever it is, why this? And then really, I mean, there are thousands, millions of artworks I could pick, but I'm picking very specific ones. So in Took House, there are poems based on Annie Leibovitz, photography by Annie Leibovitz. There are poems based on Eva Hesse. There's a Santa Fe poet, Judy Tuoletstewa, whose painting I sort of work into one of it's not a direct ekphrastic piece, but her painting's in there. Donald Judd, Robert Rauschenberg. So there's a lot of minimalist work, emptier work, but then certainly the Rauschenberg is not at all. It's a piece, for anyone who knows it, it's the piece called Bed, in which he put a quilt and a mattress and a pillow painted, splattered on a wall. And it's very busy. It's very energetic, not at all minimalist. But so it's why these works and what are these works doing for me? I've written about a lot of artworks. And so when it came time to figure out what I wanted within Took House, I narrowed really. Instead of saying, what should I write? I was working from things I had written and what fits. With the Raptor poems, I wrote them specifically for Took House. The ekphrastic poems I've been writing for years and years, decade and a half. And I would say, I guess I could say that the main poem in the book, there's one super long poem, and it's an ekphrastic poem based on the work of Donald Judd. It's a specific work. Donald Judd worked in, among other things, worked in the box shape and steel. And in Marfa, Texas, there is an armory that holds 100 of his boxes. They're untitled. And I found that incredibly inspiring, in part because they were empty and I could fill them. Or they were filled with light and I could look at the light in new ways. I could look at the reflections, the space, the way they were the same and also different. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up that poem. I'm going to pause real quick because I forgot two important things. I was just too excited to start the chat. One, if you have your questions or you come up with questions while we're chatting, please just throw them into the chat box and I'll kind of weave them in as we're going. I see we have one already that I'll weave in. And then the second important thing is please buy Lauren's book. I think we should have a link to Tupelo Press coming in the chat if it hasn't been posted there already. But yes, there it is. So please buy the book. And yeah, that's one of the most important things. And all right, so we'll get back to the craft. But the Donald Judd poem, the kind of long, expansive poem full of different prose and repetitions. I really was drawn to that piece, not only because it is kind of like the centerpiece of the book, but just because of what it's doing with repetition. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about repetition specifically in that piece and how it relates to the artwork itself, which is very striking. I looked it up online and I'm sure it's even better in person, but the way that those boxes, they repeat, but they also have a reflective quality. So the repetitions are never the same. And that's kind of what we get in parts of that poem. So I wonder if you could kind of talk about that use of repetition there.
Yeah, the boxes. So I'm in New Mexico. Marfa is not impossible destination from here. It's a driving trip. And I was asking my husband if he remembered when we went. And neither of us exactly remember, but it was maybe 2006. I began the poems in Took House in 2005. So, and the book came out this year. So you do the math, it's been a long time of putting it together. And so this morning I was looking back through some of my earlier drafts of certain poems and certain parts of the manuscript. And the big poem about Donald Judd is called Empirical Theories of a Box Maker, just to give it some context for you. I began it in 2011, but I think I traveled to Marfa in 2005 or six. So first of all, there's that, but also I am a very gleeful, I think that's the right word, gleeful reviser. I am so happy to be in the process of writing that my poems morph a lot as I'm trying to make them into something that's surprising to me, that's new and exciting to me, that is saying something that I don't yet know. So it was interesting to me this morning as I was looking back to see where, like way back in my drafts, to see where the poem had started, because I didn't remember. And it started strictly with a list of what I was filling the boxes with. So the poems, it's a sequence. There are a number of parts to it. But when I first wrote the poem, when I first drafted it, I knew I wanted to fill those untitled boxes with something. And that part stayed. It shifted some. I ended up adding some new things that contextually fit with Took House specifically, but just to give you, anybody who doesn't know the poem, just to give you a little bit of a sense of this, I'll read you just a small segment from the center of this, this section of this poem. This untitled box of days to never remember, this untitled box of isolation, this untitled box of dust or of dusk, this untitled box of voices, this untitled box of translucence, this untitled box of hours, this untitled box of suggestion, this untitled box of glances. And there are 100 of those, because there were 100 boxes I got to fill with whatever I thought they held, but also whatever I needed them to hold. So that's where that poem started. That repetition seemed, in that section especially, seemed so logical to me as a place to start. When we made this pilgrimage to Marfa in 2005 or 6, I remember wanting to go because I had heard about it, and because I am often drawn to minimalist art, and also because I didn't think it was going to be interesting. Just be really honest. It's 100 boxes. And they're like, what's the big deal? And it was a very big deal. It was a very fascinating experience to see the light moving through the space and against the surfaces. And to see that it's all glass on, it's a huge, used to be an ammunition factory, I think. And so it's all open to the Texas light and the way the light's shifting. And I was very moved by it. And so often what I'm doing in writing about something is holding it, capturing it, questioning it. And it just seemed like those boxes could hold what I needed them to hold. And I was going to explore those 100 possibilities. And so I spent a lot of time counting through those 100 possibilities and really fine tuning them to make sure. So it's a repetition, but it's a shift, where sometimes it's what the boxes hold is emotional, and sometimes what they hold is something different, is something easier.
Yeah, wow, that's great. I love that idea of, looking at something and it not just trying to capture it in writing, but to see what perhaps poetry can do that maybe that specific art couldn't quite put in words in a way. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's like you're translating it, so in that way, it's the translation. You can't translate a color into language, you don't really want to. They're two different wonderful things. And so how do you do this in a way that brings in who you are and what, what you see? And I think for ekphrastic work, I can enter anywhere. I'm not necessarily describing the work. I'm not necessarily giving the history of the artist. It's possible I'm giving one little corner that interests me, or one color that interests me, or whatever it is. Why today this work?
Hmm. I'm going to pop into the chat real quick because we have some questions coming. Two are kind of related. One is asking, were any of your poems inspired by different kind of music? And then Lindsay's asking, what kind of music did you play or practice before becoming a poet?
Okay, I'm not a musician. So no music. I don't play any music. For 15 years, I did a radio show for our public radio station here, Santa Fe Public Radio. And my show was, so I was the producer and the host. My show was combining different genres of music and bringing in poetry. So every week I would read 3 poems that mattered to me that week, that I had found in books or wherever. And I would voice them, and I would voice them between different selections of music that I had picked. So for me, the music making was the figuring out how one song in one genre would mesh into a song, usually in another genre, because I was more interested in the way they match and the friction, the way it could move, it could pick up the chords or the sounds, the general tone, and then shift. I think one thing that becomes very clear about me is that I'm not really good at static things. I'm not interested in doing the same thing. I'm not interested in doing what I know. So most everything I'm doing is trying to figure something out, is trying to figure out what can engage my ear, my eye, my pen, whatever it is. So I don't play any music. And so this was my way of playing music, and also putting voice and language into the music mixing I was doing. But I will say that my general music of choice is jazz. And I think that informs a lot of my poetry. The improvisation, sometimes the return, because I think that jazz has that, it's not exactly a repetition, but that return to maybe a line or something familiar, that quoting of things. The other music that I really love is Arabic music and the sound of the oud. And I saw a question somewhere, I'm not really following the chat, but I saw something about an ethnic background. So this might also be a good time to address that in the context of writing, because for my 3rd book, 100 Hungers, which is about my father's childhood, it's about a number of things, but it's about my father's childhood in Baghdad, Iraq. I wrote a good amount of the poems, especially the poems about his childhood, to the sound of the oud, to the long, stretched out, wailing, exotic sound that oud music makes, at least to me.
That's really interesting, thinking about the long stretched out, because when I was going back to 100 Hungers before this chat, I noticed how so many of the poems have such long lines across the page. So it really kind of clicks when you say that. Yeah, I love that.
I think for me, it was another way to shake up something, to change how I was going to hear something. So if I'm used to hearing in whatever my ear sort of naturally goes to, in the length of my breath, or in what I think of as a jazz line, let's say, then this is a way I can shift out of that into something that better fits the theme I'm writing about at this moment, which was about a place I really don't know, and trying to capture that culture.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, the chat is so vibrant. I'm like loving all of these questions in here. And we have two that kind of are talking about revision maybe in form. So I'll kind of lump them together. Joshua's mentioning, how do you balance a sense of surprise in your poems? And is there tension between them that you're conscious of as you write or revise? The instinct to make to get a poem to make sense to its readers. So I guess, that balance between making sense and still having that surprise.
So I think, no offense, but I don't think about any of you for a long, long time in the process. I don't have space to think about you, until I think the poem's almost done. So readers don't even factor into my sense of anything I'm doing on the page or on the screen. I need it to make less sense to me, I think, than what I thought I was entering with. So in a way, it's making new sense or unmaking the sense. And sometimes, so I'm being very contrary here. And sometimes, let's see, let me reread this question. How do you balance or negotiate sense and surprise in your poems? So I need to throw in whatever kind of surprises I can for me and then make sense of that for me. And sometimes that's a really slow process. Sometimes that's that doesn't necessarily happen together. Sometimes that's, here's the surprise, and then I put it away and come back to it and realize, okay, there's not enough sense here. So that's where poems start for me, is with what I know. Often they're narrative, not always. Sometimes they're just gobbledygook. And from which I am now trying to say, okay, can this poem be something, anything? And as I tell my students, there's always something you can save from it. And if you're willing to not hold things as precious, maybe what you save is a phrase or this tiny, I don't know, light, this tiny, something. And then you build a new poem around it. But there is a point, just because, I have to let readers in at some point, there is a point where I put the poems together into a working manuscript. And at that point, I'm starting to look to make sense and to make through lines and to make connections and to build things to be stronger for whoever the audience is. So I don't, and so the tension's always there. The tension's there for me, partly because that's interesting to me. I don't want things to be easy. That's why I'm writing poetry as opposed to something else. Poems for me are hard. It's not so much that they are, it's not a painful kind of hard. It's just, they're hard to get right. I love that about them. Actually, that's one of the finest things to me about them, is that I can't go in knowing what I want and get.
Yeah, there's a way that, we can have so many intentions for a poem, but the poem might say no, and the poem might take you on a different tangent and take you in a place where you didn't know you needed to be. But that's what the poem is urging for. And that is what's fun about it. That surprise as a writer. And Michael's asking a little bit about form and revision. So how does the form of a poem reveal itself to you? And how much is revealed during the original draft as opposed to revision?
Well, let's see, since I was looking back through some of these poems, particularly in Took House today, I was really realizing how many dozens of drafts I had done, in which sometimes I changed the tiniest things. But what I saw, because I don't keep track. I mean, I keep track of the drafts, but I don't keep track in my head of what I've done. What I saw was that I have this wondrous ability to accordion poems, to go from smaller to large, back to smaller, but a different kind of smaller, back to larger, like just I'm stretching them out. I'm stretching them down the page. I'm stretching them out across the page. I'm pulling out words. I'm reordering. So I think probably it's different each time, but I think probably the form reveals itself during revision much more. Yeah, it's a really good question that I think if I had a steady recipe for, it would get boring.
Yeah, it goes back to that idea of surprise, right? If it was a set formula, there wouldn't be that surprise.
Yeah, I absolutely admire the people who can work within one particular form over and over. My books don't do that typically. I mean, I don't usually write them as books. I write them as individual poems, but I'm looking for and sometimes it's what else I'm working on at the same time, because I'm often working on 3 or 5 poems kind of in the same general time frame. And so if I've got a couple of poems in couplets and I go over here and this poem also happens to be in couplets, I'm probably bored with that. Or I'm probably like, okay, all I do is write in couplets. I'm going to shift it just to see what happens now. So it's sort of dependent on how I've lumped poems together to look at, which is very, very various.
Yeah, I feel like my first draft defaults are always either like couplets or like a sonnet length. And I'm like, I need to stop. Like, I need to do something else.
Both, yes, to both. Couplets,
Right.
couplets are like the perfect thing. I think couplets are my default. I think they're so satisfying to me that it's almost like it's like a self-challenge. All right, does it have to be couplets? Can it be something else?
Yeah. And that's where the revision part really comes alive, where you're pushing yourself to let your mainstays kind of fall away and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. I wondered if we could talk a little bit about the Pantoum, since that form is super fun and just really gets that repetition on itself. But did you know that you wanted to do the Pantoum form within this book, or did that kind of come along as you were putting the poems together and seeing, oh, this form would be good for this poem at this moment in the collection, something like that?
I want to do at least one Pantoum in every book. It's my life goal. I think the Pantoum is an amazing form that is both a container and an opening. It's not too specific for me. So just like this is true of me. I'm very transparent about how I am. I'll be the same with all of you. There are 55 of you or 54 of you plus me. I'd be the same with all of you. The truth is, I can't follow a recipe. I can't bake because I can't measure, because it drives me crazy to have to measure. So the Pantoum is just enough measurement without me having to level off the stupid, measuring cup. It says repeat this line, but it also says allow it to shift, or it comes in a new way. So for me, it's a form that it's a form that fits my personality without telling me what's going to happen. For anyone who doesn't know, the pantoum repeats lines. Every line is repeated, but each time the line comes back, it comes back and forces you to acknowledge it in a new way, to look at it in a new way. Also, I think pantoums are the most fun form to teach. They because even beginning writers can come in and write something and be surprised by it. So the pantoums that are in here, I think remember I shifted it into a pantoum, but the other one was a pantoum. So, invariably I'm looking for a way to do one, to do two maybe. I don't want a lot. I think it's sort of a spice. It's a nice, I don't want a book full of pantoums. I taught a pantoum workshop a few weeks ago, and I told the students that once you're in pantoum mind, you kind of can't go and read any other poems for a little while. But it is a form I really love.
Yeah, we're getting some requests if you would read one of the pantoums for us, and we'll really get that repetition. Yeah.
Actually, can I read the pantoum? This is a question for Emily. Can I read the pantoum from 100 Hungers?
Oh yeah, go for it.
Hang on, let me see if I can find it. Okay, it's called Pieces of Leaving, and it is about leaving Iraq. And there are a few words in here that you might need to know. Talit and tefillin are Jewish prayer garments. And then a little later, it talks about the souk, which is a market, the Dijla, which is the Tigris River, and Sahra, which is desert. Pieces of leaving. Gather everything. See the scar on his leg? A talit, tefillin, brown boiled eggs. May God save them from danger. They learn to leave again, less prayer than body in continuous sun, a sympathy for starting over, the possible, all they can hold. A talit, tefillin, brown boiled eggs, may God save them from danger as they tend and pack the rose and myrrh, mirror and trousers, a sympathy for starting over, the possible, all they can hold. What's been taken away is the truth, not the warning. As they tend and pack the rose and myrrh, mirror and trousers, each wearing only the blessing of his or her reason, what's been taken away is the truth, not the warning. Their hands entangled, they deal in defenses, each wearing only the blessing of his or her reason, the death of Kings Faisal and Faisal, a jar from the river, the photos. Their hands entangled, they deal in defenses. They needed the souk, the Dijla, and Sahra. The death of Kings Faisal and Faisal, a jar from the river, the photos. They learn to leave again, less prayer than body in continuous sun. They needed the souk, the Dijla, and Sahra. Gather everything. See the scar on his leg?
Thank you. Thank you for that one. I love that one from 100 Hungers. And I think you really get into a rhythm of hearing the repetitions, but every time they're introduced, they're paired with different lines, so they take on a whole new meaning, and it just propels you through the poem in that way.
Yeah, it allows, for me, it's both the rhythm, the musicality of it and the rhythm of it, but it also allows me to obsess about something and to return to it and to find new ways. And obsession is another one of those things that I work within very well. I can write lots of poems about a subject, anything that's on my mind. I can write and write and write 100 million times, allowing that most parts of those can be, just for me, just for figuring out.
Yeah, that's something that comes up in almost all of our poet craft chats, maybe something all poets have in common, but that, idea of obsession and what's really driving you to write those poems is often like an obsession with one thing or one theme or an idea or something like that. And I think that really comes through in Took House, but also in 100 Hungers. There's some connectivity between the themes there. Themes of consumption and desire and all of these things that not only connect within the poems of the book, but kind of seem to be permeating across books on a level. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about you know moving from 100 Hungers to Took House and how the poems kind of evolved over time.
Well, I think in a way, I think Hungers, of which is a pretty wide open field, right? It's a hunger, like right now, maybe there's a hunger for connection. Like I could put anything in there. Anything I want is now a hunger. Loss, hungers, loss. Those are good topics for me. Those are things I'm willing to circle around over and over. But maybe also just attention. Whatever, that's a kind of hunger too. Like I live in the desert. I live in the high desert. I love where I live. I find it very fascinating. Whereas any other place I ever lived, I didn't look as closely. So sometimes, like in these days, as we're isolating, it's a hunger for details. Desire, consumption, those are things that are, to me, that are unreachable. They have an element to them that is a, you don't get to be filled up completely. So for example, in 100 Hungers, I didn't have any of the history of my father's childhood. He wasn't able to tell me, he wasn't able to answer the questions. And so there was a huge hunger for understanding. In Took House, I'm circling around several things, but there's a main, I've been calling it a main storyline, a main through line of one element of the book is about a relationship. And there's this obsessive returning to me, for me, to try to I don't even know if it's understand it, but to try to look at it from a different way, to consider the situation from this side and what if. And I think going back to the idea of obsession, I actually think that's a positive. I think that is 100% a positive. If you are obsessed with something, some subject, and you keep writing it, you can't keep writing it in the same way. You can't just you can't write the same poem over and over. So it sort of forces, in a way, something new. How else do it's still on my mind. It's still a thing I'm interested in. There's still this desert. I'm still isolated. I still need to go out and look at details. So now what? Now what? Now what? That's very fascinating to me, to have to push into some of the peripheral ways of looking at something.
Right. Yeah. That constant reframing as a way to get closer to it, knowing that you're probably never going to touch it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I love that. We have a couple more questions coming in the chat. Liz is wondering, who are some of your favorite Arab poets?
Darwish, Etel Adnan, Fadi Judah writes beautifully, Dunya Michel. Gosh, there are many, many, many. And especially reading people for whom English is not their first language. So this is true, not just Arab, but is a beautiful way to hear language in a fresh new way. So I really like that. I like having the sort of again, it's a sort of translation, but just the way people using a different language speak, the way their sentences are formed, the way their thoughts are formed, the way their attention is formed is a pretty valuable thing also to introduce surprise for me.
Nishi's asking if poetry, okay, so this goes into a quote. If poetry is so much a tyrannical discipline, you've got to go so far so fast in such a small space, you've got to burn away the peripherals, as Emily Dickinson says. Where is the music of spontaneity and improvisation in it? That's interesting. Let me read that quote again.
I don't actually think of it as a tyrannical discipline, though. I do think of it as a discipline, and I could see where it would be tyrannical if you came to it with a critical concern for getting it right. Maybe I think my ambition is to stay in the world of the poem. And it's lucky that I'm very willing to start poems and set them aside. So it doesn't have to be the world of one poem forever, but I'm so happy in the world of the poem, in the conversation I'm having with the poem, where it is going to tell me something I have no idea. So, what if I throw some line into it or some element into it that I hadn't intended? Now what am I going to do? Well, that's a discipline, but it's a play too. It's a kind of it's a threat, and it's a challenge, and it's a game in a way. And so if I go back to Took House for a second and tell you I had this main storyline of a relationship, and then I decided that I needed the book, because now I'm thinking in a book form at that point. I needed the book to be more than that storyline. That wasn't interesting enough to me, even having written and rewritten these poems for probably 10 or 11 years at that point. So I needed to add in other elements, again, to introduce surprise, to maybe to shift the discipline, to again throw myself back into how to shape the whole thing. So my two other elements became ekphrastic poems and poems of raptures. I had ekphrastic poems. I had a lot of them. And so then it became, okay, which of these will fit? Does this fit? And if so, which of these fit? I had no poems of raptors. I didn't have enough information. I didn't know enough about raptors. I only knew that I liked looking up at them I was like completely compelled by them. So I started doing a whole lot of research, and I wrote those poems, which was a kind of discipline and a kind of and a great amount of pleasure to learn the specifics, and then to fit it into that main storyline in little touchstone places.
Yeah, I love when the poems you write, drive you to learn more about something that maybe you had just, been observing, and then they push you to learn more and really kind of expand in that way.
Absolutely. It's like the best form of education. You're going where you want to go.
Right.
To go. And because you have to then be able to economize, place it in something, you actually, you have to pay attention to what you're learning.
Yeah. Athena is wondering, do you read the poetry of others as a way of avoiding stasis? And if so, who? And have your choices about who to read changed over time?
great question. For so my radio show was called Audio Saucepan, and for that radio program, I selected 3 poems a week, which meant I read probably 5 books, read or skimmed 5 books a week, at least, to try to figure out what I was going to share. In other words, I don't read the occasional thing. I like consume. It's like a buffet. I just pick from all over. I don't want to write something that's derivative of anyone. So I actually want to read a lot. I want to read a lot of different people, a lot of different styles. I want to pick, a tiny bit from here and a tiny bit from here. And I might not even be picking, consciously, but I don't want to write like anybody else if I can help it. And I want to hear my own voice too, more than anything. But I want to be shown, hey, look, there's also this doorway and this window, and have you looked over here and can you try this? So I don't know if that answers your question, Athena, but I think my choices haven't really changed over time because I think I have 400 books piled on my floor, and in addition to many, 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 many shelves of books. And so I just take 3 books and, and sometimes I just sit on the floor with the unread books and just love them. I mean, really just love them from the covers, like from the, like it's like I could run my hands along the spines and be like, oh yeah, you're going to be great. So yeah.
That's a dream, to just have a floor covered in books. And yeah, that sounds incredible. But there is something that's so such a driving force when you read so much other work. It's not always for inspiration, but it also just like shows possibility and experimentation and all these different things. I'm also I'm chuckling a little bit that the radio show was called Saucepan because you mentioned that you can't cook or do any of that. So it's making me laugh.
I love to cook.
Okay. Okay, just the measuring. Yeah, that's great. Let me see. We got, kind of lots of great feedback about the Pantoum. Liz is wondering where you teach, and if people want to get in contact with you, how would they do that?
Oh, sure. I teach community workshops more than anything else, and you can send me a note through my website if you want, and tell me you want to be on my class list, and I'll gladly put you on there. Or you can email me directly, lauren@laurencamp.com. Now that we're in quarantining times, the community workshops have become anywhere workshops, and that's really kind of fun. I also teach for Poetry Out Loud, a program that is a recitation program for students to memorize and recite poems. And it's high school students. And to me, it's such a powerful program because I am teaching these kids how to embody the poems, which is really how to embody themselves in a different way. Basically, I teach all over the place. I teach at the community college when possible. I teach a memoir class. What I don't do is teach through traditional academic, through the academy.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. I'm sure just based on how vibrant the chat is, I'm sure you'll be getting some messages after this. And we're kind of winding down. I see one last question from Nishi in the chat. Okay, a new one came up. Let me see. Okay, we're asking for a response to a quote. Poetry aims for an economy of truth. Loose and useless words were not separate from loose and useless thoughts. Poetry was not simply the transcription of notions. Beautiful writing rarely is. I wanted to learn to write, which was ultimately, okay, a quote from another poet. I'm not sure what the question is there. Maybe just asking for, well, I guess this would be the perfect moment as we're wrapping up to, what kind of craft advice do you fall back on when either you're writing or teaching, that those little nuggets that really kind of keep you going when you feel stuck.
Move between poems, move between pieces, be patient. I think patience is the thing that I'm forever saying. Be patient, be patient, be patient, be patient with a poem, be patient with yourself. But by that I don't mean it means allow the thing you're writing to become something more than you know it can be. Allow yourself to become something more than you are in the moment of writing. Read a lot, but like put the poem, put the draft away and have a life. Even if that life is moving on to the next poem, do something different. Shake yourself up enough, see the news or see the birds or see, whatever it is, have things happen so that you can come back to it as a new person with fresh eyes, and do that a bunch of times. I mean, that has for me given me, it has layered my poems in ways that feel much richer to me than the initial thing I wrote. I can't get those layers in a first draft, even if my first draft is remarkable. And I've had at least one of those, but maybe only one. If that first draft is finished, then there's no layering of other things. And what if, like a lot of times I will go to a poem and I will just push a word in there, a word that I like today. Oh, I want to put in, like yesterday, I wanted the word rise. It's not that great a word. It was just interesting to me. And I put it into a poem somewhere. I didn't write a sentence. I just like dropped it into the poem. And then I was like, do this, fit this in. And that's a real, that's a layer. That's a layer I now have to work with. Or deciding I want raptors in my manuscript is a layer I now have to work around. That to me, like, be patient, let your poems be whatever they're going to be, and just enjoy the process of it. Do a little, set it aside, do something else. Write down all your ideas. If you have a thought about something that you think you want to write, or a line, write it down, start something, even if that's as far as you get. So those are some of the things that work really well for me, is just playing, really. It's sort of the discipline of playing.
Yeah, that's great. Wow. I feel like we could talk for the rest of the night, but it is 6:00. So it is kind of the end of our chat here. Thank you, Lauren, for being so generous with your process and talking about these two books, but Took House especially. Please, everyone, buy the book. You heard a few poems from it, and I hope that piqued your interest, and please continue to support Lauren's poetry after the chat.
Thank you so much, Emily. I loved it. Thank you, everybody, for being here.